We've talked about Mitt Romney. We've talked about evil. Not an intentional juxtaposition, genuinely. But from evil to the conversation about guns and even a conversation about the Supreme Court, that I think is a reasonable juxtaposition. I get it. Americans want to have their guns, right? I understand, a lot of the arguments in favor of gun ownership. You can build a case, and one that I will not refute, that someone should have the right to own a gun or carry a gun, provided that they can demonstrate that they're proficient and competent and not crazy to protect themselves or their family. You could build a case that someone should have the right to own a gun to go hunting. You could build a case that someone should have the right to have a gun for competitive shooting. Like, I don't know if you've seen the picture floating around there about our show's senior executive producer, Louise Hartmann, firing a .22 target pistol. You could build a case that someone has a right to a gun if they're in the business of protecting the nation, like the National Guard or the reserves. In fact, that last one, that last on that list, was the real original reason the Founding Fathers wrote the Second Amendment. It was to protect the nation. Rewind back to the early days of America. Even after the British were beaten back in the Revolutionary War, there was still tremendous fear that America was vulnerable to attack. Could be the Spanish coming up from Florida, or the French, or the British again coming down through Canada, which they eventually did. And most of our Founding Fathers also had an enormous fear of standing armies during times of peace. After all, thousands of years of history showed them that great nations that kept standing armies during times of peace were often taken down by those very armies in military coups. Jefferson wrote exhaustively about this. He even threatened to blow up the Constitutional Convention to make sure that the Constitution didn't get ratified if it didn't include a protection against standing armies. In 1787, he wrote a letter to his protege, the opposite of mentor, James Madison. James Madison was, in 1787, writing the Constitution. That was the year of the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson at that time was the U.S. envoy to France, so he was in Paris at the time. And he was kind of micromanaging the Constitutional Convention from afar. And he wrote this, and Madison had sent him a first draft of the Constitution, and Jefferson sends him back a letter saying, I do not like, in the new federal Constitution, the omission of a Bill of Rights providing clearly protection against standing armies. In 1814, Jefferson wrote, the Greeks and Romans had no standing armies, yet they defended themselves. Their system was to make every man a soldier and oblige him to repair to the standard of his country whenever that was reared. This made them invincible, and the same remedy will make us so. Right? So here's Jefferson calling for a national conscription, everybody a member of the local militia. And that's why they formulated the Second Amendment, which would provide for a well-regulated and well-armed militia that could be called on should the nation be under attack from without. Again, the Second Amendment is there to protect the government, to protect us, for us to protect ourselves. Our government is us, to the extent the Koch brothers don't completely own it. But recently, especially since President Obama took office, that rationale has been flipped on its head. And many, particularly on the right, are starting to talk like the Second Amendment is there to protect the people, you and me, against our own government. As if a militia in South Dakota armed with rifles, handguns, and shotguns could somehow beat back the U.S. Army, with cruise missiles, tanks, and drones. They can't. This idea that the Second Amendment is a protection against tyranny from our own government is a canard. In fact, it's worse. It's a lie. A lie that's increasingly used today to paint President Obama as a radical who wants to take away our freedoms. But leave it up to Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia to give credence to this outrageous and, frankly, dangerous belief.
The amendment does not apply to...
Really there to protect the people from their own government? Then we'd have to have more than just handguns, right? We'd have to have heavy-duty weaponry, like, for example, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher.
The amendment does not apply to... arms that cannot be hand carried. It's to keep and bear, so it doesn't apply to cannons.
Did you catch that? Scalia is making the argument that since the Founding Fathers specifically said the right to bear arms, then any weapon that can be carried in someone's hands is good to go. It's unclear if the same logic applies to remote control for a weapon, like a drone, since anyone can bear a joystick, right? Or if it applies to nuclear weapons, since anyone can bear a triggering mechanism, or maybe just nuclear weapons that, could be fired from your shoulder. They're in development. Trust me. Tactical nuclear weapons. This is the sort of wacky logic that comes from Scalia whenever he clings to this originalist argument of the Constitution. It's his argument that the Constitution is dead. It's not living and breathing to adapt to a changing nation. It should be interpreted based solely on the words the Founding Fathers wrote at the time. And only Scalia knows what was in their heads. So in the debate over gun control, Scalia doesn't care about new weapon technology that our Founding Fathers couldn't have dreamed of, or mass shootings that would have sickened the Founding Fathers today. He only cares about the words, and in particular the word bear. Seems silly, especially since, for all Scalia knows, Founding Fathers meant, or maybe not, that we should have the right to bear arms, as in the arms of bears. You think? There's an originalist argument for you, Justice Scalia. But jokes aside, this is a serious debate, literally life and death. And for a Supreme Court justice like Antonin Scalia to say this issue is settled because of one word used by our Founding Fathers, the word bear. Look out, I'm going to hit you with this bear arm. It's not just irresponsible and intellectually lazy, it's dangerous. Saying that Americans should have the right to a handheld rocket launcher that can take down an airplane, that does serve a purpose that Scalia knows about. And that purpose is to add more legitimacy to those who believe that the Second Amendment was written for us to protect ourselves from our own government. And thus the people should be just as well armed as their government. That is not what our Founding Fathers intended. The Second Amendment is there to protect our government from foreign invaders, not from President Obama, who's just trying to give you health care. And if you think it's bad that we have a Supreme Court justice who doesn't understand that, just think about this for a minute. If you think it's bad that Antonin Scalia doesn't understand the plain language of the correspondences between Jefferson and Madison and all these, it's all there. Just think how many more wacko Supreme Court justices we'll have if Mitt Romney wins the White House. Mitt Romney, who has said his template for a Supreme Court justice is Antonin Scalia. Right. A guy who goes duck hunting with a criminal, or a guy who's accused of a crime, and then sits in judgment of that criminal a couple of weeks later and lets him off. In this case, Dick Cheney. Really? That's your idea of a brilliant Supreme Court justice? Scalia, by the way, in that conversation, he also said, I don't criticize the president because he doesn't criticize me, right? In other words, he's saying he's a god of some kind.